Welcome back. We're unpacking the recent Davos conference put on by the World Economic Forum. And joining me again is Andrew Lawton, author and senior journalist with True North. Thanks again for joining me, Andrew. Before we went to commercial break, you brought up a very good point, and one that I don't think the media or myself even spent enough time on, is that when you have politicians going to this conference and then you have people who are paying for access, if that happens in Canada, we have lobbyist registries where we know who's meeting with whom, and that's all on the up and up. In Davos, there is no such registry. So is this perhaps a vehicle to circumvent that kind of the lobbyist registry?
Yeah, I mean, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I think it is doing that. And the one thing that's very funny here is that the World Economic Forum's annual meetings look like any other conference you've ever been to, where you're walking around in the hallway and you see someone you haven't seen in a while and you go and chit chat with them, and there may be nothing sinister about this. You go to the bathroom and, you look to your left and, oh, it's the King of Belgium there or something, because it's just a very high tier of people that are there. And the problem is that, sure, there may be nothing wrong with the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada bumping into the president of the Bank of Montreal or something and having a little chat, or Mark Carney, who's a frequent flyer at these conferences, going and catching up with old friends of his. But the question is about what the actual discussions are, because it isn't benign when they come out of these things, which they do every year, with statements announcing they've joined this other task force or they've started this partnership. One that came out of this time was the Trade Minister of Canada, Mary Ng, joined some climate partnership at the World Economic Forum, and she announced this as part of something that was with other countries. And you look at this and say, well, what conversations led to that? And when did this happen? How did it happen? Why do we not know about it until after the fact? And I think that's where it's distinct from the formal diplomacy that takes place in a way that may still have some conversations that are going on behind closed doors, but there still is, at the bare minimum, some democratic oversight of those processes.
And so what is the harm, if I can use that phrase, term, if the trade minister joined this other group? Does that require some kind of legislative process? Do they need some kind of approvals, or can they just do what they like?
I think the harm depends entirely on what the country or the world leader is going to do. So, for example, Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat senator in the United States, was at Davos, and I interviewed him, and he actually was pushing back against some of the anti-oil agenda that we see there. So he was saying things that I think were actually entirely valid, and I was glad he was bringing up there. On the flip side, though, you get other politicians that want to be a part of this WEF agenda. People like Chrystia Freeland, who actually sits on the board of trustees for the World Economic Forum and has never really accounted for whether there is perhaps a conflict of interest there. And why it's problematic is if you have people in leadership positions in Canada that want to adopt this agenda that no Canadian actually voted for. And I think there's the issue there, is that you have this club mentality where people want to be members of the club, and that actually seems to trump what is supposed to be them representing their national interests when they go abroad.
So you mentioned the WEF, the agenda. What are you referring? What is the agenda of the WEF?
So one interesting dimension is that the WEF claims it doesn't have one. They claim that they're just a platform. They have a table at which people can sit down and meet. But if you watch the sessions, if you watch the public discussions they have, there's a very pointed approach that they bring specifically on climate change. Let's just focus on that alone, which is one that is basically committed to transitioning away from oil and gas, which has significant implications for Canada. They also talk about a lot of centralization and a lot of globalization and these international initiatives on things like digital currency, on things like internet regulation, for example, and things that I think are actually quite problematic if you look at it in the context of countries deciding to hitch things that should be domestic issues to these global partnerships. So I do think that there's an agenda that trends towards globalization, which is, again, a word that means different things to different people. But just if you look at Canada's economy and just to focus on the environmental issues alone, the WEF agenda is committed to an energy future that would be catastrophic for Canada.
My goodness. Yes. I watched some of your coverage, and based on what I was hearing, including some of the comments from Senator Manchin from West Virginia in the United States, you're right. It would decimate our oil and gas sector, which, in the context of the global conflict or the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, you could see how, had we just been ahead of this and not transitioned out of oil and gas, we would be in a better position to help the world at this point. Anyhow, we're going to stop for a commercial break. We'll be right back.